All right, and then I'm going to start the webinar, and we're going to allow people to come in, and as they do, we'll just talk for just a few seconds, and we'll let let people come
well,
in.
Just let me know when to share my screen and
yes, I'm going to do a little introduction of you, but really more about what today symbolizes. So today is International Day of Women and Girls in Science, and the purpose of the day is to achieve full and equal access to and participation in science for women and girls across the world. And we wanted you to know and the viewers to know that we were very intentional about the women that we invited today, and that you emulate everything that we think is exciting and cool about being a scientist, and on top of that, being a woman in science, Thea. And
thank you.
The audience today is pretty broad. We're literally across the world for yours, not to put more pressure on you.
I like
but
that.
It's a testament to how wonderful you are, how much people really love the polar bear. Both those things. All right, so I think majority of our people are in. I'm gonna go ahead and turn my mic off, but thanks again for being here and helping us celebrate International Day of Women and Girls in Science.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone here watching. So I will just share my screen. And well, actually, yeah, no, I will share my screen and then hang on. There we go. So my name is Thea Bechshoft. I am a staff scientist with Polar Bears International. And Polar Bears International, or PBI, as we're also called, we are a nonprofit that work towards keeping polar bears around for decades to come, and with them, of course, also the sea ice that they're so dependent on. So I'm going to give a short introduction to all things polar bear. It's probably going to take about 15-20 minutes. And then after that, I'll be very happy if you could ask a lot of polar bear questions. See if you can ask questions that I don't even know the answer to. That's always fun. Yeah, and then we'll take it from there. All right. So, like you just heard, today is International Day of Women and Girls in Science. And I just want to say women and girls and anyone else who identifies as such. Let's make it inclusive. Yeah. And I wanted to give a shout out to all the amazing women that I've worked with in my research over the years, my female colleagues at Polar Bears International, but also, for example, the lovely lady here on the right, Ko Deli Villanger is her name. She's Norwegian. And this is me on the left, her on the right, doing polar bear fieldwork in East Greenland. Yeah, I would not be where I am. I would not have had the experiences I've had. I would not have been as privileged and everything if I hadn't had these amazing women in my life. So, polar bears, on not just fieldwork, but actual polar bears. Polar bears exist all around the high Arctic. And what you're looking at right now is how people like myself, polar bear researchers, we often look at the world. So you have the North Pole right here in the middle. And then, of course, you have all the Arctic countries around the North Pole. And you can see that there are 19 different areas here outlined. And that's because we have polar bears all around the high Arctic. We have them in Greenland, we have them in Canada, we have them in the US or in Alaska in the US. We have them all along the enormous coastline of Russia, and we have them in Svalbard, which is a part of Norway. So polar bears all around here, but they're divided into 19 different populations or management units, if you will. Yeah. So, I also want to say that yes, they're all around here, and yes, we've divided them into subpopulations, but there's only one species of polar bear. So a polar bear from the Laptev Sea is just the same kind of animal that a polar bear from southern Hudson Bay is. They're slightly genetically distinct just because these two populations of polar bears, they don't meet they don't meet up very often because it's very far in between, but they are the same species, all of them. So sea ice is the primary habitat for polar bears. I'm sure many of you have heard if there's no sea ice, there is no polar bear, right? But why is this? Why is sea ice so important for polar bears? Well, they are supremely adapted to living not just in the high Arctic, but on the Arctic sea ice. Yeah. And if polar bears had a choice, they would be on the sea ice 24/7 every day of the year. So the primary reason, or the, well, yes, the primary reason why having a good solid platform of sea ice is important to polar bears is because it helps them when they're hunting seals. Polar bears are really strong swimmers, but they're not very fast in the water. And if you've ever seen a seal swimming, they are fast, they're agile, they're very difficult to catch. So polar bears need this good platform of sea ice that they can hunt the seals from. Usually it'll be when the sun is out, for example, and the seals are lounging on the surface of the ice because seals like to sunbathe, just like you and me. And then the polar bear can sneak up on them, grab them, eat them before they can have a chance to slide into the water. It can also be at the seal's breathing holes. So seals are mammals just like you and me and the polar bear, so they need to come up for a breath of air every now and then. And in the sea ice, they keep these holes open with the claws that they have on their flippers. And the polar bear knows, like it can smell, that these breathing holes are there and that a seal is using them. So the polar bear will hang out at the breathing hole, waiting for the seal to come up for a breath of air and take it right out of that breathing hole. And there you have it. There's dinner for the next week or so. So if there's no sea ice, polar bears really cannot hunt what is their primary, most important vital prey, the ringed seal and the bearded seal. Polar bears also use the sea ice for traveling. So yes, polar bears can swim, but studies have shown that it costs them a lot more energy to swim than it does to walk on top of the sea ice. So naturally, they prefer to walk on top of the sea ice. And there are two reasons why they travel. Well, there may be more, but for me, not being a polar bear, I'm guessing there are two primary reasons. One is, of course, to hunt. You know, they want to find the area where there are more seals, more breathing holes, more seals pupping in the spring also. But they also travel in the spring to find a mate. So polar bear mating is something that happens April, May every spring, and it happens usually way out on the sea ice. And in order to find a mate, actually, if you know black bears, grizzly bears, all the bears of the world, except for polar bears, they will usually have trees that they can rub on and they can leave a scent mark for other bears to follow, you know, to learn about them and to follow, just like dogs do. But polar bears, there are no trees where they live. And so instead of having a rub tree, what polar bears do is genius. They have these little scent glands in between their toes. And so every time they set their foot down, their paw down, they will leave behind a little bit of a scent. And this scent tells every other polar bear that comes by and smells that footprint, it tells them, is this a female? How old is she? Does she have cubs? All of these things. So this is how they find mates in the spring. And then finally, related to the mating, in some areas of the Arctic, polar bear females will actually make their maternity den out on the sea ice, under the snow, on top of the ice. Yeah. We're seeing this less and less just because the sea ice is getting thinner, it's getting more fragmented. And so oftentimes we see that the polar bears that used to be denning on the sea ice, they will now increasingly be denning on land instead, because this is where they spend the first 3 months um, of their young cubs' life. And so it's really important that they have a good solid foundation that they know isn't going to melt away under them, right? But as you can see here, sea ice, incredibly important to a polar bear in every kind of way. So now I just said that sea ice is important to polar bears, but I want you to know that sea ice is actually, it's important to the entire Arctic ecosystem. So you have that platform of sea ice that's important for the polar bear as a hunting platform. But if you look underneath the sea ice in the springtime when the sun is coming back, you'll see that under the sea ice, there's a lot of algae growing. Um, and these algae, they're actually, you can think of it as well, we say that, as it says here, that sea ice is to the Arctic ecosystem as soil is to the forest, because this is where you find the primary production. This is where you find everything that actually starts the whole food chain. So you have the algae growing underneath here in the spring. Then you have the diatoms that are living off of the algae. The diatoms are then preyed on by the copepods, which are eaten by the Arctic cod and other fish, which are eaten by the ring seal, which are eaten by the polar bear. So you see that without this beautiful platform of sea ice, the polar bear wouldn't have anywhere to hunt the seals from, but also the algae wouldn't be there, starting that whole cascade that leads to seals actually being in the area. And then, there may be a polar bear, but there would be no seals, right? So it's about the whole ecosystem. We focus on the polar bear and on the sea ice, and that's because they're both incredibly important. The majority of the food that polar bears eat every year can actually be traced back to starting with these algae, which I think is pretty spectacular. All right, so climate change. You cannot talk about polar bears and sea ice without talking about climate change. And there is a way of thinking about climate change that I learned not too long ago. It's called the heat trapping blanket. And I think it's a really beneficial way of thinking about climate change and understanding what it is. So I want to share a short little, I think it's 37-second video with you, so you can have a look at that. All right, hoping the sound works.
Climate change is already affecting some populations of polar bears. Since we get most of our energy from fossil fuels, we are producing huge amounts of carbon dioxide. You see, regular amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere act like a blanket around the Earth, trapping heat and keeping our planet at a stable temperature. However, when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas for energy, we pump rampant amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This buildup thickens the blanket, trapping too much heat, disrupting the climate, and melting Arctic sea ice.
So this is the very short story of how you can think of the CO2 emissions that we're creating every day as thickening this blanket around the Earth. And I mean, it's snowing in Denmark today, for example, and it's been pretty cold the whole month. I put on one blanket, I'm comfortable. If I put on 10 blankets, I'm probably not that comfortable anymore. And honestly, this is a really good analogy for what's going on with the CO2 emissions in the atmosphere around the Earth. One blanket is good, too many blankets, 10, 20, 50, and no one is happy anymore, right? And I promise you, this is not all doom and gloom. We still have time to save the polar bears, and I will talk about some of the climate change solutions that exist out there and how you can help in a little bit, okay? So for polar bears, I love this picture. This is a female polar bear from Hudson Bay in Canada, and it's back from the 80s at some point, as far as I remember. You can see she's enormously fat, and this is a beautiful polar bear. Unfortunately, because the sea ice is diminishing and the bears are spending longer and longer time on land, we don't really see bears in this kind of body condition anymore. But I mean, take in the magnificence that is this bear, right? I don't even know how she hunted the last seals that she ate. Like, how does she sneak up on anything? But for polar bears, it's all about being fat. Yeah. Survival of the fattest is survival of the fittest. So the rounder you are as a polar bear, the healthier you are. This is how it works. And the less sea ice you have, and the more time you have to spend away from the sea ice on land fasting, the skinnier you are, right? So bears need sea ice to stay healthy, to stay round and fat. Yeah. And this is partly this is a beautiful graphic, right? This is partly because it makes them more resilient, if you will. It makes them better at handling the months where, you know, maybe there's no food to be found if they're on land, or maybe they have really poor hunting success, for example. So when they don't have any food, their only choice is to live off of the fat reserves that they have built up on their body. So this female, for example, she came onto land when the sea ice disappeared, as it does in Hudson Bay every late spring. When the sea ice disappeared, she came onto land, and now she has to live off of this fat for, well, at least until November, right? So it's between 4 and 8 months that an adult polar bear female has to survive off of her body fat. So this female, she will likely be fine. She has a lot of body fat that she can live off of. But imagine that she came on land a lot skinnier, right? Then she wouldn't have the same resilience. She wouldn't have the same fat stores to keep herself healthy until the sea ice comes back, right? The other reason why we want our polar bears to be fat is also related to primarily the female polar bears, because it's been shown that, how to put it? It's been shown that polar bear females, you know, as the sea ice is declining and they have less access to food, to seals, they have fewer cubs and they have smaller cubs. And if you don't have polar bear cubs that survive at least the first year, but preferably 3, 4, 5 years until they become adults themselves, then you're not going to have a population that's sustainable. You remember those 19 different areas I showed you on the map? Some of those will not be sustainable. Well, all of those will not be sustainable if you take away the sea ice, because the adults may survive, you know, a skimpy year themselves. But if the young don't survive also, you're going to see population decline. Yeah, it makes sense. If you're vulnerable, if you're not healthy, if you're too small to survive in the harsh Arctic environment, then you're going to see population numbers dwindle. And so this is a map that I borrowed from our colleagues at the World Wildlife Foundation. These are, again, this is the same map. It just looks a little bit different with the colors, but these are the 19 different subpopulations. And here you can see the size of them, but also look at the population trend. So as you can see, there are actually quite a few of these populations where we don't have the exact number of bears. Up here in the Arctic Basin, there probably aren't too many bears, just because these are very deep waters. And even though there can be like that thin shell of sea ice on top, because it's so deep, there really isn't a lot of productivity in the water. there's not a lot of algae, not a lot of fish, not a lot of seals. And so if there aren't a lot of seals, you're not going to see a lot of polar bears, right? But around here, around here is where you find the bears along the continental shelf, which is very productive. And because it's very productive, it's where you have the most seals. And now 2/3 of the world's polar bears are Canadian, whether they know it or not. And Canada uses a lot of resources to more or less continually be counting their bears. So we have a good idea about most of their bears. However, here in East Greenland and along the coastline of Russia, it's very remote, it's really difficult and can be dangerous to get to logistically. So we just don't have the same kind of numbers for those bears. That being said, you can see that some populations are currently what we call stable. There are a couple here that are increasing, and there are 4 that are declining. Yeah. So these 4 populations are the ones that are feeling the brunt of climate change already. And they're teaching us valuable lessons that we now know what is going to happen in all the polar bear populations if we don't try to do something about our CO2 emissions. If we don't turn things around, then what we're seeing in these 4 red populations is what's going to happen to polar bears all around the globe, or all around the Arctic. So what do we do? What can we do? Well, so this is a little handout. You can find it on our website too. This one is primarily focused on people above voting age. But if you're below voting age, hang on, because I will get to you very shortly. Yeah. So for people above voting age, the most important thing you can do is vote. Vote and speak up. Yeah. Let your civic leaders know that you support swift action on climate change, that you want to support an energy shift. You want those renewable energy sources. Yeah. And also, and this goes for everyone, to talk about climate change. Every study I've seen shows that if we focus on the US, for example, that everyone, like the majority of adults, are actually concerned about climate change and they want positive action on it. But a lot of people, for whatever reason, don't want to talk about climate change, despite being worried about it. And we need to change this because we need to talk about things, we need to verbalize them before we actually can start, doing something about things. So talk to your friends, talk to your colleagues, talk to your whoever you meet, about climate change and just how you feel about it. Promote clean transportation and build a better future are also some of the top actions that you can take. Now I'm going to show you where you can find this handout and so many other things very shortly. But first, I want to say that if you're, under voting age, below voting age, you still have so much power. Yeah, because adults actually care what you say. They care what you are thinking about, what you're worried about, and you have all the power in the world to inspire the adults around you. Yeah, to get involved. So tell them what you've learned about polar bears. Tell them everything you know about climate change, like about the blanket, right? The heat trapping blanket that we were talking about just before. Tell them about that. Yeah, because the more people know and the more we talk about it, the more it becomes something that we can take action on together as a community. Yeah. So we got this. Yeah. And there is still time. So finally, before hopefully I see all your beautiful questions, I want to tell you that International Polar Bear Day is coming up. So if you feel like you haven't gotten quite enough polar bear talk, even after our session today, then you are very welcome to join us next, what is it today? Yeah, Saturday the 27th. which is not too far away. And if you go, oh, I wonder if I need to reshare my screen. Let's see.
I think you just need to exit the PowerPoint meeting.
Yeah, right? New share. Hang on here. We'll do this one. Oops. There, did that help?
Yes, we see your website.
All right, excellent. So this is polarbearsinternational.org, right? What is going on now? There we go. Nope, sorry. There we go. All right, so if you go to our website, you can see here in top here, it says Help Protect Moms and Cubs International Polar Bear Day. You click on that, and here you have it, International Polar Bear Day. And this page is going to show you all about what International Polar Bear Day is about. And also, very importantly, you can go here, I don't know if you see here, to the schedule and learn all about the different activities, about the different outreach sessions that you can join, all the places that you can learn a lot more about polar bears, not just on the 27th, but the whole week leading up to it. Yeah. I also wanted to, let's go to the front again, to show you that if you want to find those the handouts, or if you're a teacher, or if you just want to know what you can do, there is this button, Get Involved. So you go to that, see, still time to save polar bears and Arctic sea ice. You go there, and here you can find, click here if you're a teacher, if you're a student, here if you're a scientist, see what kind of initiatives you can be a part of. Yeah. And for the teachers, because I think we may have one or two out there, I want to show you that we also have our education center. And this is where you can find here a lot of resources, everything you ever wanted to teach anyone about polar bears, presentations, lessons, resources, so many different things that you can use to teach your kids about polar bears and about climate change and about climate change solutions. Yeah, so I think that was all I wanted to say for right now. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed that. And I will now be seeing if I can see any of your questions.
There are questions in both the chat and the Q&A, and there's more coming in, I think.
Awesome. Okay, we'll try and get through as many as we can, okay? Ooh, first question, a little dark, but realistic. Why are some polar bears drowning? Well, so one of the effects of climate change, as we talked about, is that the sea ice diminishes, right? But there isn't just less sea ice, it's also the sea ice that is left is more fragmented, right? So you have less of that stable platform and more ice flows instead, with water in between. And so polar bears now, they need to swim more than they did historically. And so one of the things that you have to do to drown is to be in the water, right? But the problem also is that when you have the sea ice that's a lot more scattered, more fragmented, you also have more waves because the wind can easier build up bigger waves. And so you have the combination of polar bears that have to spend more time in the water alongside bigger waves, and actually also climate change can also have the effect that it creates more wind. So if you combine all of those things, that explains why there are some polar bears that drown. Yeah. Let's see. Right, here, I like this one. Isn't too much fat unhealthy for polar bears? See, you would think that, right? But polar bears are, like I said, they're superbly adapted to living where they do, but also to eating what they do. Yeah. So polar bears, they love to eat seal, but actually what they really love to eat is seal fat or seal blubber. So a polar bear that's doing okay in body condition will actually focus on eating just fat, which to humans is just mind blowing, right? Because you and I, we can't do that without, it has some health consequences for us down the line. Polar bears, however, they're so good at when they ingest fat. I think it's 97% or so of the fat that they ingest is simply pulled out of the bloodstream and onto those fat stores. So they have this amazing capacity to store fat, and stored fat isn't a problem health-wise, right? The problem health-wise is the fat that you have in your blood vessels. So polar bears have figured out a way to do this, to eat seal fat, almost exclusively a seal fat diet and still be healthy. Right. I have two questions here, which I think they're basically the same. Yeah, they are. Angelo is asking, what is happening to the seals, right? And that's a really good question. And I love that you thought about this because, like I said, climate change has an impact not just on polar bears, but on that whole ecosystem, right? And those seals, the ring seal and the bearded seals that are the primary prey for polar bears, they're actually called pacophilic seals, which translates to ice-loving seals, right? So just like the polar bear's life is tied to the sea ice, the same is true for these species of seals. And we are seeing, not as much research has been done on this, unfortunately, but in the areas where research is being done on seals, we can see that their body condition is actually getting worse. Yeah. So climate change means that there is not as much food for the seals. They're getting skinnier. And that, of course, is also not good for the polar bears because they want nice, juicy seals to eat, right? We're also seeing that there can be instances where seal pups, so the seal pups are born on top of the ice, but under snow. Yeah, in the spring, it's seal pupping season. And they're under the snow, of course, because that protects them to some degree against predators like polar bears and Arctic fox and some of the gulls. Yeah, because if they're just lying out in the open on the sea ice, then they're pretty easy to pick off because they can't really swim, they can't leave, they're basically mostly consist of fat. So every predator out there wants to eat them, right? So seals need that good layer of sea ice and the snow on top of it in order to be able to reproduce successfully, right? So we are seeing an effect on the numbers and on the body condition, the health of seals also. Yeah, good question. All right. Let's see. Good question here from YouTube. I didn't know they ate the same kill for so long. Do they hide it or store it? So there are actually examples of polar bears, maybe they catch a bearded seal, which is a pretty big seal, or sometimes they can even find what do you call it, like beluga white whales that are trapped in the sea ice. And if it's a large male polar bear, it'll be strong enough to take one of those and drag it out of the water, and that is food for quite a few meals, right? So they will drag their kill onto the sea ice, and if there is any snow, they will cover part of it. Sometimes it's the whole thing, sometimes it's only part of it. It's a behavior that we haven't seen it too many times, but that's, polar bears have a lot of life without humans watching them. So it could be happening more or more rarely than we really know. We're not entirely sure why they do this. It could be because they don't want the scent to carry. So if you have a fresh kill, of course, there's a lot of scent involved. And anytime there's anything that smells interesting, you will have other polar bears in the area getting curious, coming up to see if maybe there's a little bit left over and maybe it's their turn to eat, right? And if you're a polar bear, you don't want anyone else to steal your meal. So maybe that's why, for the scent. It could also be because they want to cover up, just visually, they want to cover it up, right? So that polar bears walking by, they don't actually see this fresh kill. Because if you have a relatively white sea ice surface, and you have a big black, red kill site there, then that would be pretty easy for other bears to see and again come up and potentially steal the kill. Yeah, so we don't entirely know how often it's done. It's only been seen or reported in the literature, like I think maybe 5 times or so, 5 to 10 times. So yeah. Usually though, if it's a ring seals are fairly small, like 50 kilos or so, depending. And polar bears can ingest a lot in a very short period of time. So usually they'll just polish off whatever they can eat and then probably take a snooze or go out hunting again. Yeah. Do polar bears experience hunger when they're living off of their fat stores? I don't, as long as they have fat stores to sustain them, I wouldn't call it hunger. Yeah, because they still have energy. They still have, their little, what do you call it, their lunch packet to live off of, right? But it probably feels different. I mean, for sure, their stomach would be fairly empty. Sometimes they eat grass and berries and such, but I'm sure that doesn't feel the same way. So maybe it feels a different way to live off of your body fat stores than it does to, eat a seal and live off of that. But I wouldn't know. I'd love to ask a polar bear, but yeah, maybe someday. Here, are there laws? I love all the questions you were sending, by the way. Keep them coming. Are there laws in Canada about hunting polar bears to protect them? So there is, around the high Arctic, in the various polar bear countries that you saw on the map in the beginning, there is, except for in Svalbard and in Russia, there is a legal quota hunt happening. Yeah, so that means that the government will set a certain number of polar bears that can be hunted in a year. Yeah, and I mean, as long as it's sustainable and as long as the hunters are good at what they do, which they usually are when it comes to polar bears, then it's honestly no different from the hunters that I'm sure some of you guys know that go hunting for deer or ducks or similar. So, but yeah, there are laws to protect polar bears, but they also allow for this quota hunt that we call it for indigenous people to hunt a certain number of bears every year. All right. Oh, someone said, I missed it. What is your website? The website is polarbearsinternational.org, org for organization. Yeah. All right. Would decomposition be slower in the cold? Thinking about what you said about the smell, do Arctic animals have better sense of smell than other animals? Things absolutely decompose slower in the cold. Yes. Partly because it's cold, but also because there are less critters around to lay eggs in you know, whatever we're talking about, or to eat whatever we're talking about. Less insects, less bacteria, less activity in those groups. So yeah, decomposition is a lot slower in the cold. And Arctic animals, do they have a better sense of smell than other? I want to show you this. Hang on. I have this, oops, replica of a polar bear skull. Yeah. Now, keep in mind, this is an absolutely enormous skull, right? I mean, look at that. This is from a huge adult male bear. Yeah. And again, it's a replica. But what you can see in polar bears is, let's see, that's better, right? You can see that they actually have a really big nose. They have this Roman nose, some people like to call it, just because it's, well, I mean, it's beautiful, but it's also, there's a lot of it, right? Because you have the snout all the way out here. And the reason why they have this huge nose is that they have these little bones in here. They're winding all around the place. They're very fragile. But what they do is that they actually make the surface that they have their, what do you call it, the cells that help them with their sense of smell. They cover an enormous area. And that's because this is why for polar bears, sense of smell is their most important sense. For humans like you and me, we're visual creatures, right? We rely primarily on our sense of sight. For polar bears, it's all about their sense of smell. So yes, polar bears have a brilliant sense of smell. For other Arctic animals, it's maybe their hearing or their eyes, but for polar bears, it's definitely about their sense of smell. Just gonna put this over here. All right. Yeah. Okay. Good question. Speaking of eyes, do polar bears see color? So no one, to my knowledge, has done any study of polar bear color vision, but there are indications that maybe they're not quite as good as us at seeing the color green. Yeah. And I mean, evolutionarily, that would make sense because if you're out there on the sea ice, you don't really need to be able to see a lot of green. So yeah. But other than that, I don't know. I mean, obviously they can pick out different colors. There are some colors that are more attractive, or what do you call it, attracts them more than others. But yeah, like sometimes, I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it right here, but in some pictures, you'll see that the polar bears, they have this teeny tiny, like my fingernail sized little white plastic marker inside their ear. And that's when researchers have a polar bear in hand, they will give that polar bear a unique ID number. And this ID number is on this little ear marker. I forget the right word for it right now, but on this little marker in the ear. And those markers used to be various colors, like different colors, way back when people first started actually going out on the sea ice, sedating bears, handling them. And this was a problem because the bears would chew them off each other. Like they were different, they could see them. This may be something edible. But then they changed that little ear tag to be white. And after they did that, this was no longer a problem. So, I mean, there are differences, but we don't entirely know how a polar bear sees the world. Okay, whew, big question. Let's go here. Let's see. Can polar bears eat other things? Yes, they can. Polar bears are very opportunistic. If something smells different, if something looks different, they will, well, I mean, never say always, right? But usually a polar bear will go there and investigate it. And the way that polar bears investigate things is to smell them, to, you know, move them around a bit with their paws, but also to take a bite out of things, right? So polar bears will eat or try to eat most anything. If we're talking about proper food, if you will, then yeah, they eat grass, they eat berries, they eat bird eggs. They'll eat whale carcasses that have washed up on the shore. I mean, they'll eat most anything out there if they're hungry enough and if there isn't anything else. Oh, they also eat kelp, like, you know, the big macroalgae that you can sometimes find washed up on the shorelines too. Yeah, but we also have examples of polar bears that especially in Svalbard, I know this from, but it's probably an issue other places too. But polar bears that love to eat the seats of skidoos, snowmobiles, whatever you usually call them where you're from. But you know that it probably has like this nice chewy texture, and maybe it even smells a little bit like the gas, the fuel. Yeah, so I know of several people who have had like the seat of their skidoo eaten. Yeah. There are also, I remember hearing stories from people who have done autopsies of polar bears in various parts of the Arctic where they will find garbage. So plastic bags, yeah, just generally just, yeah, garbage. But I also remember one story with a bear with barbed wire in its stomach. And that just blows my mind because I don't see how you start eating barbed wire, like how hungry you have, or unfortunate you have to be to do that. So yeah, polar bears will absolutely eat most things that you put in front of them. Let's see. What could potentially happen to polar bears and other Arctic ecosystems? Maybe other Arctic to the Arctic ecosystem and to polar bears if global warming doesn't improve? Well, I mean, it's really quite simple. If we don't have sea ice over the productive areas, not sea ice in the middle of the not around the North Pole, because like I talked about before, the water under the North Pole is very deep and there's not a lot of life in it. There's not a lot of productivity. There aren't any seals for the polar bears to eat there. But if we don't have sea ice anymore over the continental shelf around the high Arctic, then ultimately we won't have polar bears anymore. And there will be an Arctic ecosystem because we still call that area on top of the world, we still call that the Arctic, but it would be a very different ecosystem. It would consist of other species. Yeah, so it wouldn't be the Arctic that you know and hopefully love at the moment, right? Yeah, very different. Let's see. Ooh, this one is good. Why do polar bears have white fur? So, first of all, you guys have excellent questions. Please do keep them coming. Why do they have white fur? Well, two theories. One is that because they have, let's see how. One is that white fur, it's white because it's not white, right? But they don't have any pigments in their hair. And so they look whitish, yeah? One theory is that those whitish hairs without pigment, they allow the sunlight to actually better penetrate all the way into the skin of the polar bear. And polar bears have black skin. Either, again, we don't know for sure why, but it could either be because black is really good at retaining heat and keeping the bears warm during those months where you actually do have the sun around. And it could also be that the black skin is a lot better at protecting against the sun's harmful rays, right? So it could be a protection too for the bears. So one reason why they have that clear or white fur could be because of the sun. It could also be because they are, as camouflage when they're hunting for the seals. So a lot of animals will be able to take on the color of the environment just so they can blend in a little bit better. And for the predators, such as the polar bear, that would then make make it easier for them to blend in as they're sneaking up on the seals. But I mean, a lot of people think about the sea ice as this super white environment, and in reality, I mean, yes, it is white-ish and it is very bright on a sunny day, but sea ice is in many areas is messy. Yeah, like it's broken up, and sometimes you'll have the underside of the sea ice come up, and you can see that, and they make all sorts of shapes and shadows and such. So it's not actually as white as we often imagine. And so for polar bears and for seals, they're used to not different colors necessarily, but definitely white and black and everything in between those two, right? Like the whole grayscale. So I don't know if they'd be scared of a polar bear if it wasn't completely white, or they're not completely white. They're more of a yellowish vanilla ice cream kind of white. Yeah. All right. Let's see. How do they take care of the baby? Good question, because I was talking about the maternity dens. So polar bear cubs, when they're born, are absolutely tiny. Yeah. A newborn polar bear cub is about the size of my hand. That is very small. It's like, what is it? Up to 800 times smaller than its mother. Yeah. And this is the reason why polar bears have maternity dens, because the female will be in the den. She's there for a month or so before she gives birth to the cubs, 1 to 3 cubs, an average of 2 in each litter. And she will then stay in there with the cubs and nurse them for about 3 months before emerging, usually sometime in March. Yeah. And that's how they take care of them. So they have this den to protect the little tiny cubs until they're big enough to actually hopefully be able to survive outside of the den in the actual Arctic cold and in the snow, and to flee from other bears if need be, together with their mom. So that's the primary way that polar bear moms take care of their cubs. Now, after they emerge from the den, the cubs are actually with their mom for about 2.5 years, about two and a half years. And that's because it's complicated to learn how to be a successful polar bear, right? They have to be able to navigate on the sea ice. No one really knows how they do that. They have to be able to find the seals, and also they have to be able to hunt seals, so hopefully successfully, in an environment that is constantly changing, right? And also they have to hunt in 3D, if you will, right? Under ice flows, over ice flows, swimming. So it's just it takes a lot of learning to become a successful polar bear, and that's why they're with their mom for comparatively long, watching her hunt and learning how to be a polar bear. Let's see. What are some defensive mechanisms polar bears have to defend themselves against predators? Well, the thing about polar bears is that they don't really have a lot of predators, right? They're the top dog. They're the top bear, I guess, in the high Arctic. So obviously, like we talked about earlier, there is some hunting going on, but it's hard for a polar bear to, defend itself against a rifle. So they can't really do that. I mean, they can run, but that's about it, or swim. Other than that, sometimes, like I said before, with the cubs, there is cannibalism between polar bears or in polar bears. What we see most often is that it's, if there's a female with cubs, usually younger cubs, and there's a male that comes by, a big male, he may actually try and eat the cubs. Probably simply because they are food. Yeah, there's no other reason, we think, than that. But they may be an easy meal, or they may not be an easy meal, depending on how strong the mother is. Yeah, so we have seen examples of that. Also, as the sea ice is getting more scattered, we're actually seeing more and more orcas, or killer whales, come into the Arctic. They usually aren't really in the high Arctic because they have that huge dorsal fin, the big fin on their back, and that doesn't really go well with sea ice, right? But now that we're seeing the sea ice being more scattered, we also see that there are more orcas. I've never heard of orcas hunting polar bears, but I would definitely also call the orcas a top predator in this, new Arctic ecosystem that we're creating as we speak. So yeah, there's also stories of the Greenland shark having polar bear bits inside its stomach from people who have caught the Greenland shark and dissected it and looked at the stomach content. But Greenland sharks, although they're fascinating creatures in themselves, they're not fast at all. And so we think that the polar bear bits that they have in their stomachs is simply because they've found a dead polar bear in the water, and then they've, eaten chunks of that. So yeah, I can see that we're almost at the top of the hour again. I am sorry I didn't get to all your questions. They were brilliant. Really happy to have been here with you. Thank you so much for joining. And if you have more polar bear questions, absolutely check out our website and join us on International Polar Bear Day on the 27th, and also that whole week leading up to it.
Thank you so much for being with us. If you don't mind, I have one scientist question. I'm wondering how often you use computational thinking or math in what you do.
Oh my God, I use math all the time. Yeah, I really do. So part of being a scientist is doing a lot of math, a lot of calculations, a lot of statistics. I mean, the best pictures are from when you're in the field and doing field work and being really active, but a lot of my time is spent in front of the laptop with Excel sheets and programming and doing calculations, because that's how you go from data, or that's how you really get to understand the data that you're collecting in the field.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you, and I hope you'll be able to join us next year as well.
Absolutely.
All right. Thank you, everyone. See you at the next webinar. Bye-bye.